Welcome, everybody, on behalf of the Holocaust Museum LA. My name is Michael Morgenstern, and I am an educator at the museum. And this afternoon, you have the honor and privilege of listening to Gerda Cipher, a Holocaust survivor from Poland who will share her story with you. And afterwards, you'll have the opportunity to ask her questions. Before we begin, I'd like to share a quick history of our museum. Holocaust Museum LA was founded in the early 1960s by a group of Holocaust survivors who wanted to make sure that people would always remember and learn from this tragic history. They did this at a time when most people in the 1960s were not yet ready to talk about the Holocaust. And therefore, many survivors weren't yet ready to relive their trauma. But thanks to their courage and foresight, we have what became the first and oldest Holocaust museum in the United States, always with the mission to commemorate, educate, and inspire future generations. We can't do the work that we do today without our survivor community, who still on a regular basis shares their stories with groups to make sure that you as future generations can continue to share this history. It is my honor and privilege to introduce Gerda Seifer, who has been involved with our museum and our community for a long time, and who Gerda has shared her story with so many students, not only in the Los Angeles area, but the Long Beach area. And she and her family have been active with our museum for a long time and have made such a positive impact on our community and our educational programs. So I'm so happy to introduce you today. Thank you so much for joining us today, and you may begin.
Thank you. And thank you for coming to listen to me. I'm speaking today because it is important, and you are just as important because you are listening to what I have to say, and hopefully you will be sharing my history with others. So to everyone listening to me today, thank you very much. And here is why it is more important than ever before for me and for any other alive survivor to speak. Last week, I went to my dentist's office, and his windows, which face the outside parking lot, had graffiti on it, Jewish stars and anti-Semitic writing. I found it very frightening. He's not alone. Businesses, schools, and houses of worship have been targeted with similar anti-Semitic attacks. Flyers that say every single aspect of the Ukraine-Russia war is Jewish, and every single aspect of the COVID agenda is Jewish. Anti-Semitic incidents have risen 27% in California last year. And that's nearly triple what they were in 2005. It is sickening, it is frightening, and it is why we should never forget. I have been speaking to students since 1972. But I want to tell you what happened the other day. I spoke to my granddaughter who lives in Santa Monica, and she said, "Grandma, I've had the worst part of my life. I had to spend 10 days in a room separate from everyone because I got a COVID infection." And as I was listening to her, I was thinking, she's 16, 17 years old, and staying in her room for 10 days has been the worst part of her life. What was my worst part of the life? Well, my worst part of life was living during World War II, being under German occupation, where I spent 6 weeks in a pitch black cellar, all alone in a tiny little cubicle, not knowing what's going on outside, not knowing what's happening to my family, and depending on the woman who was hiding me and who would bring me a meal a day. Comparing to my experience, her experience was just not comparable at all. I come from a town called Przemysl, which was in the paper recently because people from Ukraine were running to Przemysl to get out of Ukraine. That city was on the border between Russia, Ukraine, and Poland. I was an only child. I had a lovely childhood. I was loved by my parents, and my parents were strict with me and gave me a lot of confidence as well. I wrote a book called The Girl in the Cellar, because as I was speaking to people, they all said, "Have you written a book?" And I said, no, I haven't. There are people who have been in concentration camps and they had written books, but I haven't written a book. And people suggested, why don't you write a book? Out of 38 relatives, family living just close to ourselves, only 2 people survived in 1945, and I was one of the 2 survivors. The other person who survived was my cousin, who was in a concentration camp in Auschwitz and Buchenwald, and I found him after the war through the Red Cross. And so I felt that perhaps with just me being alive and my cousin, I should mention about the people who are my family and what happened to them. Today, we hear a lot of people claiming that we are making up stories, that the survivors not telling a truth. Well, of the 38 people, if there are 2 only alive, would I be lying about it? In 1939, the war broke out. The Germans occupied Poland very quickly, and very soon the anti-Semitic laws were enacted. Jews had to wear armbands on their elbows. In our area, it was a white armband with a blue Star of David embroidered on it. If you did not have the armband on you when you were outside, you would be arrested and probably shot afterwards. Try to imagine for a second, how would it feel if one day you go to school, you have friends, you have neighbors, you talk to everybody, and the next day, suddenly, people don't talk to you, you are their enemy, you cannot go to school because you're Jewish, you are a completely different person. When you're 12, 13, 14, it is very hard to understand and to abide by those rules. Yet you do it because you know your life depends on it. Jews could not go to school any longer. Jews could not work in a store any longer. Jewish stores were converted were first of all robbed and demolished, but what was left was taken over by the city. We couldn't go to the park, we couldn't go to a movie, we couldn't go on a street after a certain time early in the evening, could not be found on the street at night. And that was the least of our problems. They would come in the middle of the night, banging on the doors. The Nazis would walk in and start checking your apartments or houses for whatever they were checking for, supposedly arms. While they were checking for arms, they also, which they never found, they would also take everything that they wanted to. Any jewelry, silverware, dishes, clothing, whatever they liked, they would take it. And you were standing there saying nothing because you had no rights. One day, my father, who was working in a textile factory, my father used to have a fabric store, and he knew a lot about textiles because he studied in France. So he worked in a factory that was making fabric for the Nazi uniforms. Therefore, he was a useful Jew. But one evening when he came home, around in 1942, he whispered to me, "Gerda, pack a little package of clothing and toothbrush and toothpaste. You're going into hiding." I couldn't ask him, what hiding? Why am I going into hiding? I just had to listen and do what he was telling me. So quietly, I went and picked up some underwear and toothbrush and cleaning things. And there I was ready to go into hiding. I went to my mother, whom I absolutely adored, and said, "Mommy, please hide. Take care of yourself." And she said, "Yes, I will." She embraced me and gave me a kiss. And that was the last time I saw her ever after. We lived with my cousin Richard, who was a couple of years younger than I, lived with us. His father was sent to Russia earlier in the war. His mother, my mother's sister, was living with us and with Richard. One day, my Aunt Helen, that's his mother, went out to get bread. You always had to stand in line. You couldn't just go to the store with your coupon and show them the coupon, get the bread. You had to stand in line. Well, my Aunt Helen never came back that day. We don't know what happened. She was probably picked by the police. And after 2 or 3 days of her being absent, we realized she was never coming back. So Richard was living with us. Obediently, I went outside with my daddy, met the woman who used to be our ex-neighbor, lived in a big building across the street from where we used to live before we moved into the ghetto. And I walked with her to her house, to her apartment. We said nothing on the way, we just walked very quickly. And of course, I was not wearing an armband. She took me into her cellar in an apartment building. Every apartment had a few, about 6 by 5, 6 by 4 feet cubicle where they stored for winter their vegetables and wood or coal. This was summer. The cellar was empty, and she took me to that cellar, had a box, wooden box for me to sit on. It was pitch black there, except for tiny little window way up in the ceiling, which happened to be right at the base of the street. And she told me, be quiet, don't make much noise. I'll be there in the morning, I'll bring you breakfast. And also I'll change your chamber pot. And she left. Here I am in this tiny little cubicle. The floor is dirt. The shelves right now are empty. And there is the box on which I'm sitting. And I think, well, what am I going to do? There was no light. I couldn't read. I couldn't make movements except stand up and sit down. I couldn't make any noise because there were other people who might come to their own cubicle, and if they heard noise or movement, they would get suspicious who was there in darkness, and I had to be quiet. Imagine being 14 years old, out of your loving home, suddenly all alone, not knowing what's going on in this world. One day I couldn't take it anymore, sitting in that cubicle. I was so anxious to get out and to see a little bit of sunshine that I, unknowing to practice to myself, I opened the door of the little cellar, walked up a few steps, and then I was on the corridor of the building. And next thing, I was on the street, standing there like a dummy, not knowing where to go, what to do. I knew it was dangerous to be there. And yet I was missing the sunshine and the sky and the freedom. While I was standing in the middle of the street, which luckily was very empty at the time, the woman who was hiding me lived on the ground floor of the apartment building. She happened to look out of the window, and there she saw me. My goodness, if anyone saw me there and realized that I was hidden by her, both she and I would be shot. She ran up outside of the building, looked both ways to make sure nobody was watching or walking by, grabbed me by my arm and whispered, "What do you think you're doing? You're crazy? You want to get killed?" I remember saying, "I don't care. I don't care. I can't take it anymore. I just don't care." She took me into her kitchen, gave me a cup of tea, and convinced me to go back to the cellar. By the way, I did write a book eventually, a few years ago. It's called The Girl in the Cellar. And this is the book which you can get on Amazon or anywhere else. And this is the book I wrote about my whole family because there was no one left to write about them. if I hadn't written anything, they would have died, never being remembered by anybody or anything. I stayed in that cellar for 6 weeks altogether. And one day, she told me, I'm going to take you back to the ghetto. Your father said it was safe to go there. I was thrilled that I could get out of this little black cellar. And on the way to the ghetto, I kept saying, how is my mother? How's my mother? And she would be very impatient with me and say, she's okay, she's okay. Somehow her answers didn't ring true. When we got to the ghetto, she left me and I went back to where we lived before I went into hiding. My daddy was waiting for me. I said, Daddy, where's mommy? He put his arms around me, sat me down on a bed because we had no chairs there, no room for chairs, and had to tell me what I did not want to hear. Evidently, he sent Richard into hiding the same night as he sent me into hiding, except that Richard didn't want to stay in that hiding, and he ran back to the ghetto the next morning. My mother could have gone into hiding alone. Only people in the ghetto who were working were saved from being taken away. My mother didn't work, couldn't find jobs. And so she and Richard were rounded up by the Nazis the next day, and they were taken away. I never saw my mother again. This was the most tragic moment in my life. My mother and I were friends, not just mother and daughter. We understood each other so well. She was a wonderful lady. She was intelligent. She was a great cook. Everything she did perfectly. And all my life, I've been trying to behave the way she did. I never quite succeeded. But when I heard that my mother was gone, unbeknownst to me, I lost my memory. For many years, I didn't realize that I lost my memory. Until one day when I spoke in school, and I started speaking in schools in America in 1972. I would go to the high schools, junior high schools, universities. I've even spoken to kindergarten students. I've spoken to any groups that needed a speaker who were willing to hear me without having to pay me for my time. And the more I spoke, the more I realized there was part in my life which I couldn't remember at all. And that was the time when I learned that my mother was gone. My mommy and Richard were rounded up while my father stood helpless watching them because he was useful and wasn't going to be taken away. They were both taken to a train that went to Belzec. Belzec was an extermination camp. Nobody who went to Belzec was made to work. As soon as the train arrived in the camp, people were unloaded from the cattle cars, told to jump quickly, get undressed, and they told to walk into showers, except there were no showers. It was a Zyklon B gas that was spread into the room, and they died in about 20 to 30 minutes. I try to think at times, what was my mother doing with Richard? Was she calm? Was she trying to make him feel better, give him some hope? Or was she scared to death? Questions I never got answers to. But I realized many years later that I cannot remember what happened after my dad told me about my mother and Richard. Anyhow, my father was desperately trying to save me, and he found a woman who used to have a illegitimate child who died in infancy. This woman, at that part of her life, in 1942, was starving, having 4 kids in the house, including a new baby. And she couldn't go to work because the baby was so young. She did have another illegitimate child earlier on who died in infancy. And I became that child. Had this little girl lived, she would have been about my age. And so when I moved into her apartment, I became Alicia Schumacher. Took the name of the child who died. I had to call her mom after losing my wonderful mother just a few weeks earlier. I had to change completely and remember only the facts about Alicia, that what happened to her when she was a little girl and what happened now. I was the sister of 2 boys, 2 teenage boys, and a little girl and a baby. Those are the kids who lived with this woman whom I had to call mom, because she could get a job to earn enough money for food for everybody. I had to stay home, take care of the baby, a 4 or 5 months old little boy, take care of the teenage boys, do the cooking, washing laundry, cleaning, and whatever had to be done. I changed my life completely. I became a different person, and I had to remember every moment of my life from then on that I was not Gerda Krebs any longer. I was Alicia Schumacher. I had to learn all kinds of prayers. I had to know all about Catholic holidays. I had to be a different person. And I better not make any mistakes. I couldn't cry because I had no reason to cry, but I did have inside of me, I had reason to cry for my mother. When Daddy sent me into that hiding to live with this woman, he said to me, be brave, be a good girl. I'll see you after the war. And so I lived with the hope that I will see my daddy after the war. My new mother was not a good woman or not a nice woman, but she did save my life. She didn't do it because of her good heart, but because she really needed me so she could go to work. And she could not only needed me at home, but she had to make a living. Her husband was at that time in Germany as a war prisoner, and she and he were not really a good pair. They were separated before the war. But one day he was released from the prison and showed up at the door of our apartment. So here was a man who had 2 boys and a girl as his children. And all of a sudden he had another little child, a little baby boy, and this girl, me, being there as well. She told him I was Jewish. She felt that she could trust him. And I found out later on he was a very decent human being. And so we started living together with him. At one point, he was making candles to sell in the market because there was no electricity any longer. I had to take those candles to sell them. And I would walk around the marketplace, I remember, with my candles, always hungry. And there were peasants from the country with their wares of vegetables and fruit and cheeses. And I would go from one peasant to another, one stand to another, take a piece of cheese, one piece of cherry maybe, or some fruit, whatever, and then would sort of make a face like it wasn't good. And I would move on to a next stand. Actually, I was always hungry and the food was delicious, but I didn't dare to spend any money on the food because my so-called mother knew exactly how much money I would bring back after selling the candles. And then one day, the war was over. I wasn't particularly happy. I didn't know what to expect. I looked out of the window one day and I saw this couple walking down the street, very pale. They looked white. And I realized they must be Jewish because they were not exposed to sunshine. They were in hiding for a long time. I wasn't going to leave this woman, not knowing where to go. And so I stayed with her, anxious to hear from anyone, from my father or any relatives. I did go to the International Red Cross office, left my address and way to get in touch with me. And I was looking for anyone connected to my family. Sadly, the only person I found out was an older cousin, the son of my aunt, who was taken to concentration camp, and he was liberated by Americans. He was the only one who contacted the Red Cross, and we started writing to each other. He lived at that point in Germany and wanted to end up his schooling. I was still in Lwow, Poland, which now is Lwow or Lviv, Ukraine. I finally told my mean mother that I was going to leave. And she said, "You cannot leave until I find a replacement for you." And I said, "Of course, I'll wait," knowing full well that nobody is going to come and take over my job without getting paid, living like I have been living with her. But I pretended like she was really going to get somebody else. A lady contacted me who knew my parents before the war and told me she would like to take me in and even adopt me because her child was killed. She would send me to school and she would take care of me as if I were her daughter. I was thrilled to bits. She sent me money for a train ticket, but my so-called mother opened the letter before she let me have it. She read the letter and then she took the money out and said, "Can I borrow this money?" And I weakly answered, "I guess." There was nothing I could say. She said, "Well, you have to wait till I get some replacement before you leave." Weeks and weeks went by and nothing happened. Every so many weeks, I would meekly ask this woman, "Have you found anybody?" And she would say, "No, not yet." I became very discouraged, very depressed. I was thinking of committing suicide. And then I talked to myself because that's the only person I could talk to, and said, "Gerda, your father tried to save you so you would survive the war. And you did survive the war. And now you're going to kill yourself. Be brave and leave this woman. Go and meet with the lady who sent you the money." I knew this lady a little bit, not too well. And so one day I gathered all the courage I had. And when my mother came back from work, I said to her, "I'm leaving today. I need the money for the train ride. Please give it back to me." She was furious. "Is that how you're treating me after I saved your life?" she said. But she did go outside to an apartment above us where her cousin lived to borrow the money because she had no money to give it to me. Well, she ran upstairs. This woman's husband came up to me quietly and said, "Leave today, because if you don't leave today, you will never leave." He gave me that little bit of confidence that I needed. And when the mother came down from upstairs with the money for the train ticket, I promptly left. It was night, it was winter, it was 1945, 46 winter. I got to this train station and there was mayhem. Nobody knew which trains were going where, when they were coming, when they were leaving, what track they were going to be on. Nobody knew anything. I kept asking questions and finally I went to one train that was waiting there, thinking that might be it. The train was full of people. Corridors and the sitting areas were all filled with people. I went up and down the train and couldn't find one space where I could get in and stand there. And so I was standing on the steps outside the train, holding onto the door, wondering what I should do when the train door closed from inside and the train started moving slowly. And there I am holding on tight onto the outside door, holding onto the handle and standing on the steps of the train, and the train goes faster and faster and faster. I was not going to leave the train and wait at the station any longer. So I just held on tight to the handle. The wind was blowing through me. My hair was blown all over the place, but I was holding tight with arms freezing to the metal handle of the train. I don't know how long I've ridden that way, but eventually the train stopped at the station and few people got out. And frozen as I was, I managed to move my legs to get inside the train, and I even found a seat. I traveled that way, grateful, until we arrived in Katowice, which was the city that the lady lived in. I got out of the train with a letter from this lady looking for her address. The first address I went to was the wrong address. It was a quiet morning on Sunday morning. The streets were covered with snow. No one has walked on them yet. I heard the church bells ringing, and I was just hoping so hard that I will find this lady. I was not going to go back to my so-called mother again. I tried another address, and that was wrong. And finally, I saw someone walking down the street and asked them if they knew where that street was. And they directed me to a building on several streets. And there was this big building, and I kept walking up and down to about the third floor, hoping beyond hope that I was in the right place. When I rang the bell, the lady who opened the door looked at me and said, "Gerda." Now, you know, no one called me Gerda for 3 years. I was Alice. And it sounded very strange for somebody to call me Gerda. She put her arms around me and said, "My goodness, I never thought you would be coming. You didn't let me know." I said, "No, I couldn't write. I had no money for the sums." And she said to me, "Would you like to take a bath?" Bath? I haven't had a bath for 3 years. Of course, I would love to take a bath. She filled the bathtub with hot water and left me there to luxuriate in this wonderful bath. And I kept thinking, but I have lice, bed bugs in my clothing, in my hair. How am I going to get rid of it? I can't wear the clothing I came in because that is full of lice. But she knew more than I did because I never found my clothing again. She gave me some of her clothing. I knew that if you have lice in your clothing, they lay eggs in the seams of anything or hems in anything you're wearing. You can't get rid of them. You have to burn it. But she did. I never saw the clothing that I came in again. She gave me some of her clothing. And I felt like a new person. And the next morning, she took me to a big office building called UNRWA, United Nations Relief Association. This was a place where people from England and America send used clothing for people like me. And when we got there, I received a decent pair of shoes that fit me fine. Mine were all torn up. I received a new skirt, and I received 2 blouses, a white one and a pink one. How rich I am, I thought to myself. I have a choice. I have to decide whether I want to wear the pink blouse or the white one. How wonderful. Can you imagine? Young girls today, they go on a date or for a special occasion somewhere, for birthday or whatever, and they go into their closet and open and look at all the things that are hanging in the closet, and they say, gosh, I have nothing to wear. When I looked at my two blouses, I looked and said, gosh, I'm so lucky. I have a choice. What shall I wear? I have two things to choose from. Can you see the difference? Can you compare the difference between my attitude and attitude of young people today in America? One day, this lady came home. She wanted to write a book about the Holocaust. She wanted to write a book about people who survived the Nazi occupation. And she would go every day in different direction in the city, trying to talk to people who survived. One day she came home and she said, Gerda, you know, I want you to be with me and I want to take care of you, but there's a rabbi from England in Warsaw, and he's taking a transport of war orphans to England. You have relatives in England who said they wanted you to come to them if I could. Would you rather go to England or stay with me? It took me about one moment to make a decision. And I said, if I can get out of Poland, I want to get out. She said, now remember, you have a building in Przemysl where your parents own the building. I said, I don't care about the building. We lost so much. I lost everybody. I just want to get out of Poland. And so she gave me money for a train ride to Warsaw that night. And I went on a train to Warsaw again. The next morning, I went to the hotel where the rabbi was staying with a letter from my relatives in England that they were willing to take me in so that I would not be a burden to the British government. And the rabbi said, yes, you can go. A minute later, a door opened from the elevator and a man came out with a little child saying, please, to the rabbi, please take my little boy. I'll get there somehow. Just take him. And the rabbi said, I'm sorry, but this girl, pointing at me, is the last one on the list. We cannot take any more children. And 6 weeks later, I was riding on a train to England. Later, I was transferred to a Swedish boat. And in 1946, in March of 1946, I arrived in England. It was the next part of my life to begin with. The worst part was over. I was all alone. I had no future. I had no money. I had no education. I never finished high school, but I was free. Freedom is so very important. We don't appreciate freedom until we lose it. You know, when there's time when suddenly electricity is out and all of a sudden you don't know what to do at night. You don't know where there are any candles, how to go, anything, because how to do anything, because no electricity or no water. Well, this is like that with freedom as well. You take it for granted, but you shouldn't, because freedom is precious and the most important thing in human's life. I found nobody could speak Polish, and I could not speak English, but I learned English as fast as I could, and I tried very hard. If you are interested in my story, you can get the book, The Girl in the Cellar, by survivor of the Holocaust, Gerda Cipher. I could talk for a long time, but our hour is almost over, and I would like to be able to answer any question. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll be glad to listen to your questions.
Thank you so much for sharing your story with us. If anybody has any questions, please use the Q&A box, and those watching on Facebook can use the comments section, and we'll answer as many questions as possible. Can you please share with us how you met your husband, and at what point you told him and your children about your experiences?
When I came to America, I found that before I went to America, I went to England, as you know. In England, I learned English, and later I trained as a registered nurse. Then I came to America in 1950, full of hope, full of optimism, and there was nothing I couldn't do. If I had to, I would do anything. I was alone. I came with $50 to my name, and I didn't worry about not having a job because I knew nurses were very much in need and short supply in America. I wasn't able to get a job right away because my license was not recognized. My license was from England, and they wanted me to get another license from the United States. I finally got a license in New York City. And while I worked at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York, I met my husband. He was a resident at the time in the hospital, and he heard me speak, and he liked my accent. And so he started talking to me. We started dating, and 6 months later, we were married. My husband came from Boston. He was an internist, and he wanted to see what California was like. So after spending a year in Boston when we were married, he decided to go to California for another year. We drove across the country, and he ended up in Long Beach, where he had a job at the Veterans Hospital in Long Beach. We came here for 1 year, but we never left. My husband eventually decided to stay in Long Beach, open his office here. I helped him in the office at first, and then we started a family. We have 3 children, 2 girls and a boy. And I was very happy to stay in California because I like the weather here. We've been married since 1965. We just celebrate our 67th anniversary. Our children live in LA, Pasadena, and Santa Monica. We have 4 grandchildren. Our youngest daughter Julia is a producer at KABC Eyewitness News, and she's been living with us during the COVID and helping us tremendously because we are both, my husband and I are 94 years old now. We are kind of helpless. He cannot hear well, he cannot see well, and cannot walk well. I can't walk at all. I have to use a scooter. I can't move much, but I can still see and talk. And that's our story.
Thank you. Did you ever return to Poland as an adult?
Yes, my husband wanted to see the country where he said it all happened. It's very interesting that he was the first boyfriend who asked me about my past history. Most of the men I dated they knew I was foreign because I have an accent, but they never asked me what happened during the war. He was the only one who ever wanted to know. After we were married, he said, you know, I'd like to go to Poland. We are going skiing for 2 weeks in Switzerland with a medical group. So rather than be there for 2 weeks, let's go and ski for 1 week and go to Poland for another week. I wasn't too crazy about going to Poland, but because he wanted to, I said, okay. And I've been in Poland several times. I was lucky to get back the ownership of my mother's building. It wasn't a huge building, it was 1 story with about 12 or 14 apartments. We met some people who used to live in my building before the war, and they were very nice and kind to me. You hear a lot about people saying, what, Hitler didn't kill you? Too bad. But these people, the neighbors who used to live there before the war, who remembered me, were very nice, good human beings. And I appreciated that very much. And so, yes, we went there several times. I got my building back. I met some people that they knew me before the war, but I haven't been there for about 10 years now. That's.
Thank you for sharing. Can you please share with us a little bit about your life before 1939 and what your parents were like and what your life was like then?
Well, as I said, I was an only child. My father had a store with fabrics. He studied fabrics in France before his father gave him the store that he owned at the time. It was owned by my grandfather first. The store was on the main street of Przemysl called Franczkańska. And I remember going there once in a while as a child. I had to behave and be quiet when I went there and not to disturb customers. My father would often take me out for walks on a Sunday. We would go to the park and he would give me mathematical questions, which I enjoyed very much. Like, for instance, he would say, well, if you're on a train and you're going to such and such a town and so many miles, how long do you think it would take you to get there? And I had to figure out in mathematics what it would be like. And I love those questions, love the talks with my daddy. My mother was my friend. She was very strict, but she also kept her word. I knew that if she promised something, she would keep it. One time when I was a little girl, I was in their bedroom And there was a dressing table for my mother where everybody had a sort of a triple mirror. And there was a little stool in front of the dressing table with pompons hanging around the oval seat. I don't know what got into me, but I took a pair of scissors and cut off all the pompons out of the stool. Having done that, I realized what I did, that I should not have done it. And so I started crying very loud. My mother ran to her bedroom where I was sitting, and she says, "What's the matter? Why are you crying?" I said, Mommy, promise you won't be angry with me." No, I won't be angry, but what happened? What happened? Promise, Mommy, promise. And so she promised me, because I knew if she said she gave me a promise, she would keep it. So when she finally said, "Okay, I promise I won't be angry," why are you crying? I cut all the pompons from that seat. Well, of course she was upset, but I heard her talk to somebody later on saying, "I thought it was very clever, girl, to make me promise her not to get angry before she told me what she did." So I knew I could trust my mother with anything. My mother could help me with Latin. My mother could help me with French or German in school. She was an amazing cook and baker, fabulous baker. She knew classical music. She was very well read. She was a lady way ahead of her times. I adored her. And I lost her within seconds of one day.
Thank you for sharing about your parents. You mentioned earlier that had you not recorded your memories or them or spoken about them, that nobody today would know anything about them. And so that's why I wanted you to share a little bit about them. So thank you so much for sharing some stories about your parents with us.
Thank you. I just would like to say in closing, Holocaust was a dreadful event in humans' life. I thought it would never happen again, and I still hope it will never happen to any group of people. I feel we have to treat people independently. It doesn't matter what religion you are believing in, what color skin you have. What's important is what kind of a human being you are. We all have the same blood flowing in our veins. There are good people and there are bad people in every group. And I hope we treat people before we make a decision how to treat them, to get to know them first before we do any harm to each other. I also think we can settle disputes or differences by talking to each other, giving in a little rather than shooting, knifing people, or being cruel to each other. That is very, very important. Children learn hatred at home. They're not born with hatred. They're not born with prejudices. And so as parents, we should teach children to be reasonable and to be able to treat everybody else the way they want to be treated themselves.
Thank you so much for sharing with us today, and of course for that concluding message. I wanted to just share again with our audience that Gerda speaks on a regular basis to students and has done this for so many years. And so you leave so many students with that message on a regular basis. And we know you make a big impact on our community and on our future. So thank you so much for sharing with us today. Thank you, everybody, for your attention, your questions, and we hope to welcome everyone to the museum at some point in the near future. You can visit our website for more information on how to reserve a space. Thank you so much, and wishing everybody a good rest of the week. And thank you again so much, Gerda.
Thank you. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. And we thank you and your family for everything you do for our museum and our community.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.